My dad tried to sell my dog for $200 while I was at work, then told me, "You live in my house, so everything in it is mine, including that mutt." When I said he had no right, he rolled his eyes and said, "You're abandoning your family for a dog?" I just kept packing. That was 10 months ago. This morning, he was screaming my name as bailiffs dragged him out of court. My father tried to sell my dog while I was at work, so I moved out and took everything I owned. I've always had a complicated relationship with my dad. To be blunt, he's selfish, controlling, and has a history of acting like my belongings and my life are his to manage. Ever since I was a kid, he treated me less like his child and more like an inconvenience. When I was 8, he donated my bike to his friend's kid without even asking me. His excuse? "You weren't riding it enough." The truth was, I rode it every day until he gave it away. When I cried about it, he told me, "Stop being dramatic. You'll get over it." At 12, he sold my gaming console and all my games for a fraction of their value because he wanted beer money for a weekend trip with his buddies. He justified it by saying video games were rotting my brain and I should be grateful he was helping me. When I got my first job at 16, he constantly borrowed money from me without paying it back. If I confronted him, he'd twist it into me being ungrateful and selfish for not wanting to help my own father. As an adult, things didn't get much better. I moved back in with my parents temporarily after a breakup to save money. I paid rent, bought my own groceries, and even chipped in for utilities, but my dad still acted like he owned everything in my room. If I got a package delivered, he'd open it without asking. If friends dropped by, he'd snoop in my stuff, pretending he was looking for the remote. Now, I've always been a dog lover, and my current dog, Max, is the most important thing in my life. He's a rescue, half Labrador, half chaos, and I've had him for 4 years. He's helped me through depression, heartbreak, and stress. My dad always pretended to like him, but I caught little comments, "Dogs are too much trouble," or "He's a waste of money." I never thought he'd actually act on it. I was wrong. One afternoon, I came home from work, and Max wasn't there to greet me. He's always waiting by the door. My dad was sitting in the living room, acting like nothing was wrong. I asked where Max was, and he casually said, "Oh, a guy came by earlier. I told him we'd sell the dog for $200. He'll be back tonight with the cash." I froze. I honestly thought he was joking, but the smirk on his face told me otherwise. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I demanded to know what he meant, and he shrugged, saying, "You're at work all day. The dog needs someone who can actually give him attention. Plus, think about the money." I told him he had no right to do that. It wasn't his dog. He rolled his eyes and hit me with, "You live in my house, so everything in it is mine, including that mutt." That was it. I saw red. I grabbed Max's leash, went into my room, and started packing. My dad followed me, ranting about how I was being immature and overreacting over just a dog. He even tried to block my door at one point, saying I couldn't just leave without giving proper notice. I ignored him, called a friend, and asked if I could crash at her place for a bit. While I waited for her to come, I systematically packed every single item I owned: furniture, clothes, electronics, kitchenware, everything I had brought into that house. My dad kept yelling, saying things like, "You're abandoning your family for a dog? No wonder your relationships never work out. You're too attached to useless things. You'll be back in a week when you realize you can't make it without me." The gaslighting was exhausting. He kept trying to twist it into me being ungrateful, irresponsible, and dramatic, but I kept packing. When my friend arrived, I loaded everything into her truck and my car. The last thing I took was Max, who had been glued to my side the entire time, tail low and ears back. My dad stood in the doorway, arms crossed, glaring. Before I left, I turned to him and said, "You'll never see Max again, and you'll never get a cent from me again." He started yelling as I shut the door behind me, but I didn't look back. In the weeks that followed, I made sure my dad couldn't use me as his personal ATM anymore. I blocked him on everything. I stopped sending money. And since I'd been helping with groceries and utilities, my mom, who enables him but isn't as openly cruel, had to cover the shortfall herself, something she wasn't thrilled about. For a while, I thought I was finally free. Then, last Friday, I got a letter in the mail. Apparently, my dad is suing me for stealing his property. I stared at the envelope for a good 10 minutes before opening it, my hands already starting to shake. The legal papers inside were thick, official looking, with my dad's name right there as the plaintiff and mine as the defendant. I sat down on Jessica's spare bed and started reading through all the legal talk, trying to make sense of what Frank was actually claiming. He wasn't just saying Max belonged to him because the dog lived in his house. The document listed everything I took when I moved out: my TV, my laptop, my coffee maker, even the kitchen stuff I bought with my own money over the years, claiming it was all stolen property worth $8,000 total. My stomach dropped as I kept reading. Jessica must have heard me cursing because she came in with 2 cups of tea and sat down next to me. She read over my shoulder, and her face went white when she saw the dollar amount. "You need a lawyer," she said. I told her I couldn't afford one since the sudden move had wiped out most of my savings. The next morning at work, I could barely focus on anything. Max was sleeping under my desk, something my supervisor Linda had let me do after I explained why I suddenly needed to bring my dog to the office. Linda stopped by for our usual morning check-in and immediately noticed something was wrong. I showed her the lawsuit papers during lunch and explained the whole situation. She thought for a minute, then mentioned her brother-in-law Marcus was a lawyer who sometimes took cases for free when people really needed help. She called him right there in the break room, and he agreed to meet me that evening at a coffee shop near his office. Marcus turned out to be this tall guy in his 30s who looked way too tired but seemed really interested in my case. He went through the lawsuit page by page, making notes and shaking his head at some of Frank's claims. "Most of this is garbage," he said, pointing to the list of items. He explained that receipts and bank statements would prove I bought everything myself, but Max was more complicated since I didn't have official adoption papers from the rescue organization. organization. That night, I tore through my email looking for anything from when I first got Max 4 years ago. I finally found the adoption confirmation email from the rescue group. Plus, I had every single vet bill saved, which added up to over $3,000. Jessica helped me organize everything into a binder while Max watched from his bed, tail tucked and ears flat like he knew something bad was happening. 3 days later, my work phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Frank, the only number he still had for me. Tom Brennan still wants that mutt. Drop the dog off and I'll drop the lawsuit. You have 48 hours. I screenshot it immediately and sent it to Marcus. He called me within 5 minutes and told me to come to his office first thing in the morning. Marcus filed our response to the lawsuit that same day and started paperwork for a restraining order based on the threatening text. He explained that Frank's claim on Max was especially weak since I could prove I'd been the only one taking care of him and paying for everything for 4 years. A week later, I took Max to his regular vet appointment and explained the situation to Dr. Peterson. She was furious about the whole thing and wrote up a notarized letter right there confirming I was listed as Max's sole owner on every medical record since his adoption. She mentioned Max seemed really stressed lately, probably picking up on all my anxiety about the lawsuit. That evening, Jessica sat me down and suggested I stay with her permanently instead of just crashing temporarily. We worked out a real roommate agreement with rent and everything, which Marcus said would help show the court I had stable housing and wasn't some irresponsible person who couldn't take care of a dog. Max had already claimed a corner of her backyard as his favorite bathroom spot and seemed happy enough there, though he still followed me from room to room like he was afraid I might disappear. The next few days felt almost normal until my phone rang with a blocked number while I was making breakfast. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My mom's voice came through broken with sobs, saying Frank was getting worse since I left and stopped paying for things. She kept repeating that he was taking it out on her, throwing things and screaming about the money I used to contribute. I grabbed my other phone and started recording like Marcus had told me to do with any contact from them. She begged me to just give him something, anything to make him stop, but I stayed quiet and let her talk while the recording captured everything. After she hung up, I sent the file to Marcus, who said it was perfect evidence of their harassment pattern. 2 weeks later, I was at my desk when Linda rushed over saying some guy was in the lobby demanding to see me about a dog. My stomach dropped as I heard shouting from downstairs about how he'd already paid $200 and wanted what was his. Security was trying to calm Tom down, but he kept getting louder, waving some paper around and yelling my name. Linda grabbed my arm and pulled me into her office while calling building security to handle it. Max was under my desk and I scooped him up, both of us shaking as we heard Tom's voice getting closer to the elevators. The security guards managed to get him out, but not before he screamed that Frank had promised him the dog and he'd be back. Linda immediately called HR and filed a report while I sat there trying to breathe normally again. Marcus jumped on it right away, filing for an emergency restraining order against both Frank and Tom. He argued they were working together to harass me, and the judge agreed to a temporary order. The hearing would be in 3 weeks, but at least I had some protection for now. Jessica helped me install a Ring doorbell that same night, and I started changing my route to work every day. I never walked Max the same way twice, and every car that slowed down made my heart pound. Even going to the grocery store felt dangerous, because I kept expecting to see Frank or Tom around every corner. The therapy sessions I'd started after moving out were the only thing keeping me together at this point. During one session, I broke down realizing this was the first time I'd ever really stood up to Frank. The therapist helped me see how he'd been controlling and taking my money since I was a kid. 3 weeks later at the restraining order hearing, Frank showed up with some cheap lawyer from a strip mall. He claimed he was the victim and pulled out a handwritten bill of sale from Max, dated the day before I moved out. The paper supposedly had Tom's signature on it, but Marcus immediately pointed out the obvious problem. He told the judge that Tom's harassment at my workplace proved he didn't think he owned the dog yet. The judge looked skeptical of Frank's whole story, but said she needed more time to review everything. She scheduled another hearing and extended the temporary restraining order, which was something at least. That night, Mom texted from someone else's phone with a warning that Frank had found out where I worked. She said he was planning something and begged me to be careful before the number blocked me. I showed the message to campus security the next morning, and they gave me permission to work from home. Linda was completely supportive and set up daily video calls to make sure I was doing okay. Working from Jessica's kitchen table became my new normal for the next month, while Max stayed glued to my side. He could sense how tense I was and wouldn't leave me alone for even a minute. One afternoon, while looking for old tax documents, I found my high school diary in a box I'd grabbed when moving out. The pages were full of Frank's thefts and manipulations going back years and years. There were entries about him taking my birthday money, selling my bike, demanding my part-time job earnings for bills. I photographed every single page and sent them to Marcus, who said this was exactly what we needed. He said it showed a clear pattern of financial abuse and control that would help our case. 2 days later, Marcus called me while I was at work and told me Frank's lawyer had sent over a settlement offer. I put him on speaker and closed my office door while he read through the document. Frank wanted me to drop the restraining order, return Max plus $2,000 worth of furniture, and then he'd drop the lawsuit. Marcus actually laughed out loud when he got to the part about the furniture. He told me he'd already sent back a counteroffer saying Frank drops everything and pays my legal fees. I knew Frank would never agree to that, but Marcus said it was worth putting on record. The next Saturday, I was at the grocery store loading bags into my car when I saw Tom walking across the parking lot toward me. My heart started pounding and I immediately grabbed my phone while Max started barking barking from inside the car. Tom got right up in my face saying Frank had promised him that dog and he wanted either his money back or the dog. I backed toward the store entrance while dialing 911 and told the operator a man was threatening me in the parking lot. Tom kept following me, getting louder about how I'd stolen his property and Frank had every right to sell that dog. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled up and the officers separated us to get our stories. Tom admitted to the officers that he'd paid Frank $200 but couldn't explain why he'd pay for a dog that wasn't Frank's to sell. The officers told him about the restraining order and warned him not to contact me or come near me again. Tom stomped back to his truck yelling that this wasn't over and he'd get what was owed to him one way or another. After that encounter, I couldn't sleep properly for weeks. Every notification on my phone made my heart race, thinking it might be Frank or Tom trying something new. I started checking the doorbell app constantly, sometimes 20 or 30 times a day just to make sure nobody was outside. Max picked up on my anxiety and started sleeping on the bed instead of his dog bed, his ears perking up at every sound. Jessica noticed how jumpy I'd gotten and installed extra locks on all the doors without me even asking her to. During this time, Marcus kept working on our case and called one afternoon with interesting news. He'd found court records showing Frank had been sued twice before by former tenants for keeping security deposits and claiming their property. Both cases had been settled out of court, but Marcus said it showed a clear pattern of fraudulent property claims. 6 weeks after the lawsuit started, I woke up to pounding on Jessica's front door at 7 in the morning. Mom was standing there crying so hard she could barely talk, still in her pajamas and slippers. She kept saying Frank had locked her out and was selling her jewelry to pay his lawyer fees. Between sobs, she told me Frank had been hiding money in a separate account for years while telling her they were broke. She'd found the statements by accident when looking for tax documents and confronted him about it that morning. I brought her inside and made her some tea while she showed me photos on her phone of the bank statements. There were deposits going back 3 years, small amounts here and there that added up to thousands of dollars. I helped her call the police to report the jewelry theft and then found her a divorce attorney through Marcus's firm. While we waited for the police, Mom admitted she'd been documenting Frank's financial abuse for months, keeping copies of receipts and bank records. She said she'd been planning to leave but was too scared to actually do it until he locked her out. The police took her report and gave her a case number, but said without proof of ownership, the jewelry would be hard to recover. Mom pulled out more bank statements from her purse, these ones showing Frank had been taking my rent payments and putting them in his personal account. Instead of going into their joint household account like he'd told us, the money went straight to his private savings. She'd highlighted every single deposit that matched my rent payments, going back 2 years to when I'd moved back home. Marcus was thrilled when I sent him photos of all the evidence Mom had brought with her. He said this could prove fraud in our current lawsuit, since Frank was claiming I hadn't paid rent while pocketing the money. Over the next week, Marcus worked with Mom's divorce attorney to build a complete picture of Frank's financial crimes. I felt weird about Mom suddenly being on my side after she'd enabled Frank for so many years of my life. Part of me wanted to be angry at her for not protecting me when I was younger and needed her help, but seeing her finally stand up to him, even if it took this long, made me realize she'd been a victim too. Frank's lawyer withdrew from the case 3 days after Marcus sent over all the new evidence we'd collected. Marcus said the lawyer probably realized Frank had lied about the rent payments and didn't want to risk his reputation on a fraudulent case. That same afternoon, Frank started sending dozens of texts to Mom's phone, calling us both traitors and saying he'd destroy everything we loved. Mom showed them all to Marcus, who immediately added them to our restraining order request as evidence of escalating threats. 3 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse watching Frank pace back and forth in front of the judge's bench like he was giving some kind of TED talk about parental rights. He'd fired his lawyer and decided to represent himself, waving his arms around and going on about how ungrateful children were destroying America. The judge kept having to tell him to stick to the facts of the case. Frank pulled out this stack of papers he'd printed from random websites about fathers' rights and started reading them out loud until the judge cut him off. Marcus sat next to me taking notes while Frank claimed I'd stolen thousands of dollars worth of his property. The judge asked for evidence of ownership and Frank just kept saying everything in his house belonged to him. Then Marcus handed over our evidence folder with all the rent receipts, my bank statements showing the utility payments, and screenshots of Frank's texts threatening us. The judge spent 20 minutes reading through everything while Frank stood there getting redder and redder. When she looked up, she asked Frank if he had any receipts proving he owned the items he claimed I stole. He started yelling about not needing receipts for his own stuff until the bailiff stepped forward. That's when Tom walked into the courtroom holding an envelope. He went straight to the clerk and handed over a notarized statement saying he'd paid Frank $200 for Max, but now understood Frank never had the right to sell my dog. The statement included a copy of the Cash App transaction and screenshots of Frank's texts promising to deliver Max that evening. Tom also filed a claim asking the court to order Frank to return his money since the sale was fraudulent. Frank's face went from red to purple when the judge read Tom's statement out loud. She asked Frank directly if he'd taken money for a dog he didn't own, and he started stammering about how everything in his house was his to sell. The judge scheduled another hearing for the following month and warned Frank that she was considering fraud charges. 2 months after the lawsuit started, I finally went back to working in the office instead of from home. Linda had been great about letting me work remotely, but we both knew I needed to get back to normal. Every morning I'd walk Max to my car and scan the parking lot before getting in. At work, I'd check the windows every hour to make sure Frank's truck wasn't in the lot. Every middle-aged guy walking past made my heart heart race. I'd see someone with gray hair from behind and freeze until they turned around. Max picked up on my anxiety and started growling at random men on our walks. The hypervigilance was exhausting, but after everything Frank had done, I couldn't relax. My therapist's office had this weird smell like vanilla candles mixed with old carpet that hit me every Thursday at 3. I'd been seeing her for 6 weeks, and we kept coming back to the same topic. Mom was living with her sister now because she couldn't afford the house payments without my rent money. The therapist kept reminding me that Frank's choices caused this, not mine, but the guilt sat in my chest like a rock. I'd shown her the texts where Mom said she understood why I left, but wished things could have been different. The therapist pointed out how Mom never once said Frank was wrong to try to sell Max. We spent the whole session talking about how I wasn't responsible for Mom choosing to stay with someone who'd been stealing from his own family for decades. Marcus called me the next week with news that made my stomach drop. He'd been contacted by 3 of Mom's neighbors and 2 family friends who'd all gotten the same story from Frank. According to him, I'd stolen thousands in cash and jewelry before abandoning my poor sick mother. One neighbor even asked Mom if she needed help getting groceries since her daughter had left her to starve. Mom had to explain that she was fine and living with her sister, but Frank kept calling people and telling his version. Marcus said Frank was probably trying to poison potential witnesses, but it was actually helping our case since we could document his lies. He told me to screenshot any messages I got from family friends and forward them to him. Within 2 days, I had 17 screenshots of people asking me how I could do that to my parents. At 2 in the morning, Jessica's Ring doorbell started sending alerts to both our phones. The motion-activated floodlights lit up the front yard, showing Frank stumbling around the porch. He was pounding on the door so hard the whole frame shook. Jessica grabbed her phone to call 911 while I ran to the bathroom with Max and locked the door. Through the door, I could hear Frank screaming about his property and how we couldn't hide from him forever. The Ring camera recorded everything as he tried to force the doorknob and then moved to the front window. He picked up one of Jessica's garden gnomes and raised it over his head. Jessica was on the phone with dispatch giving them our address while I held Max tight in the bathtub trying to keep him quiet. We heard the gnome hit the window, but the glass didn't break. Frank kept screaming threats about what he'd do when he got inside. The sirens started about 5 minutes later, but it felt like hours. I stayed in the bathroom listening to Frank yelling about teaching me respect and taking back what was his. When the police pulled up, their lights lit up the bathroom window in red and blue flashes. I could hear them telling Frank to step away from the house and put his hands up. He started yelling at them about his rights and his property, but they weren't interested. Jessica came to get me after they'd cuffed him and put him in the patrol car. We went outside to talk to the officers and show them the restraining order Marcus had filed. They took our statements, while Frank screamed from the back of the patrol car that we'd regret this. One officer said Frank reeked of alcohol and had admitted to driving there. They were charging him with violating the restraining order, attempted breaking and entering, drunk driving, and making terroristic threats. As they drove away, Frank was still yelling that he'd never stop until he got what was his. The officer taking our statement said Frank would be held until his arraignment since he'd violated a restraining order. 10 weeks after the lawsuit started, Mom called to tell me Frank was out on bail. He had an ankle monitor and strict orders to stay away from me, Jessica's house, and my workplace. The judge had also ordered him not to contact me directly or through third parties. Mom said he'd been calling every relative he could think of trying to borrow money for bail, telling them it was all a big misunderstanding. Most of them had already heard my side from Mom and told him no. His brother finally put up the money, but made Frank sign something saying he'd pay it back with interest. Mom also mentioned Frank had been staying in his brother's basement since she'd changed the locks on the house. She said he'd shown up drunk the night before, demanding she let him in, but she'd called the police and they'd reminded him about the ankle monitor's GPS tracking. Jessica and I spent the next weekend installing security cameras around her entire property. We put them on every corner of the house, facing the driveway and covering the backyard. The installation guy said we had enough coverage to see a mouse crossing the lawn. Max had started barking at every noise outside and refusing to go into the backyard alone. He'd always been confident, but now he'd stand at the door whining until one of us went with him. The vet said it was anxiety from the trauma and prescribed a mild medication to help him relax. She also suggested keeping his routine as normal as possible, but I could see the stress in how he'd constantly check where I was and follow me from room to room. Even with the medication, he'd wake up barking at least twice a night. Linda called me into her office on a Tuesday morning, and I immediately thought I was in trouble for all the time I'd taken off. Instead, she pushed a letter across the desk, offering me a promotion to senior analyst with a $15,000 raise. She said my work had been excellent despite everything I was dealing with, and the company wanted to make sure I stayed. The raise meant I could finally afford my own apartment once things settled down. When I told Jessica that evening, she immediately said I wasn't going anywhere until Frank was behind bars or had given up completely. She'd converted her home office into a proper bedroom for me and said she felt safer with both of us there anyway. I tried to argue, but she pointed out that Frank knew where I worked and would probably figure out where I lived if I got my own place. She was right about Frank not giving up easily. Marcus called me 2 days later with news that made my stomach drop. He'd filed a civil suit against Frank for harassment, emotional distress, and fraud. The damages could hit $50,000 if we won everything. Frank got served the papers while stuck at home with his ankle monitor on. Mom texted me later that night saying he'd thrown a lamp through the living room window. She'd moved into a hotel that same evening and started packing her stuff in secret. The divorce was moving forward, but her lawyer had found something huge during discovery. 3 months passed with Frank on house arrest, and and things felt almost normal again. Jessica and I had settled into a routine with Max getting spoiled by both of us. Then Mom's divorce lawyer called with information that changed everything about how I saw my dad. Frank had been sued by 3 different employers over the past 15 years for stealing and fraud. Every single time he'd settled out of court using money from Mom's inheritance. Her parents had left her almost $200,000, and Frank had burned through most of it. The lawyer had copies of all the settlement agreements and police reports that never went anywhere. Mom had no idea about any of it until now. That same week, I got a Facebook message from someone I'd never heard of before. Derek Williams said he was Frank's younger brother and hadn't talked to the family in 10 years. He'd seen news about Frank's arrest online and wanted to help however he could. I was shocked because Frank always said he was an only child. Derek lived 2 hours away but drove down to meet me for coffee that weekend. He looked like a younger version of Frank, but with kind eyes instead of angry ones. We sat in a quiet corner booth while he told me stories that made my skin crawl. Frank had been stealing since they were kids, taking money from their mom's purse and selling Derek's toys. When Derek got his first bike for his birthday, Frank sold it 3 days later. Their parents always believed Frank's lies about Derek losing things or breaking them himself. The pattern went back decades, and Derek had hundreds of examples just like mine. He'd cut contact completely after Frank stole $10,000 from their dying mother's account. I sat there realizing I wasn't special or different or the cause of any of this. Frank had been doing this his whole life to everyone who got close to him. The relief mixed with sadness for all the people he'd hurt over the years. Derek gave me copies of old police reports and bank statements to help with our case. 14 weeks after Marcus filed the lawsuit, Frank's criminal trial finally started for violating the restraining order. He showed up in a cheap suit that didn't fit right, trying to look like a victim. The second he saw me sitting with Marcus in the gallery, his face went red with rage. The prosecutor started with the doorbell camera footage from Jessica's house at 2 in the morning. You could hear Frank screaming about his stolen dog and threatening to burn the house down. Frank's public defender tried to argue he was just upset about losing his pet. The judge cut him off and said threats of arson weren't excusable under any circumstances. Mom took the stand next and broke down describing 20 years of Frank taking her money. She listed every theft she'd discovered since filing for divorce, including forged checks and credit cards. Frank stared at her with such hate that the bailiff actually stepped closer to him. Against his lawyer's advice, Frank demanded to testify and immediately started ranting about conspiracies. He claimed I'd turned everyone against him, that Marcus was in on it for money. He even said Tom was part of some plot to steal his house and belongings. The judge had to bang his gavel 3 times before Frank would stop yelling. During the lunch break, Frank cornered Mom in the courthouse hallway before the bailiffs could stop him. He got right in her face and hissed that she was nothing without him. Mom stood up straight and told him she only regretted not leaving 20 years ago. The bailiffs dragged Frank away while he kept screaming threats that everyone could hear. The trial went on for 3 more weeks, with Frank getting more angry each time he had to sit there and listen to the evidence against him. Marcus brought witness after witness who saw Frank at my apartment building the night he tried to break in, plus the security footage showing him trying different keys in my door while looking over his shoulder every few seconds. The prosecutor played the voicemails Frank left on my phone where he said he was going to make me pay and take back what was his. When the jury came back after just 2 hours, they found him guilty on all counts, including criminal harassment, violating the restraining order, and attempted breaking and entering. The judge gave him 18 months in jail plus 3 years of probation after that. Frank jumped up and started screaming curse words at me and Mom and the jury and everyone else in the courtroom while the bailiffs grabbed his arms and dragged him toward the door. He kept yelling that we'd ruined his life and he'd get us back somehow until they finally got him out into the hallway and we couldn't hear him anymore. 15 weeks later, I was sitting on Jessica's couch with Max curled up next to me while Mom sat in the armchair across from us, and Jessica brought out a pizza she'd ordered. We were watching some comedy movie on Netflix, and Mom actually laughed at one of the jokes, something I hadn't heard her do in years because Frank always said her laugh was annoying and told her to shut up. Max had his head on my lap and kept looking up at me every few minutes like he was checking I was still there. Mom reached over and scratched behind his ears, and he wagged his tail a little bit. Halfway through the movie, Mom paused it and looked at me with tears in her eyes. She said she was sorry for all those years she let Frank hurt me and take my things and treat me like garbage. She said she knew being scared and having no money wasn't an excuse for letting him do those things to her own child. I told her I understood, even though part of me was still angry about it. With Frank locked up, the civil lawsuit moved along much faster since he couldn't show up to cause problems or file stupid motions every week. His assets got frozen by the court, and Mom's divorce lawyer made sure she got half of everything, including the house where I grew up. Frank's lawyer tried to argue that Mom didn't deserve anything, but the judge shut that down fast. 4 months after the lawsuit started, I still jumped every time I heard a noise outside my door. I checked the locks on my apartment 3 or 4 times before bed, and sometimes woke up in the middle of the night thinking I heard someone trying to get in. Jessica said it was normal after everything that happened, but it still made me feel weak. Max seemed to understand because he'd come over and put his paw on my leg whenever I started checking the locks again. One morning I woke up to Max dropping his tennis ball on my chest and wagging his tail like crazy. He hadn't played with any of his toys in months, just kept them in a pile in the corner of my room. I threw the ball down the hallway and he ran after it and brought it back, his whole body wiggling with excitement. That same week, Marcus called to say Tom had sent a letter to his office. Tom wrote that Frank had convinced him I was neglecting Max and never home to take care of him, and Tom thought he was helping rescue the dog from a bad situation. He said he was dropping any claim to Max and wished us the best. Marcus said Tom seemed genuinely sorry about the whole mess. A month later, Marcus called again with bigger news. Frank's old employer had seen the news stories about the trial and decided to do an audit of Frank's expense reports from the past few years. They found out he'd been stealing money through fake receipts and made-up business trips, over $30,000 in 5 years. Now, they were pressing charges for embezzlement on top of everything else. I decided it was time to move forward with my life, so I went to the animal shelter to look for a companion for Max. In the third kennel I checked, there was this German Shepherd mix named Luna who was hiding in the back corner. When I brought Max to meet her, she came right up to the fence, and they sniffed each other through the chain link. Max's tail started wagging, and Luna did this little play bow, and I knew she was coming home with us. Mom started seeing a therapist twice a week to work through everything that happened with Frank over the past 20 years. She moved into a small one-bedroom apartment near downtown and got a part-time job at a bookstore. Sometimes she'd call me just to tell me about a funny customer or a new book she was reading, things she never could have done when Frank was around to monitor every phone call and criticize everything she said. 6 months passed, and I found myself at the local dog park on a Saturday morning, watching Max chase after Luna, while other dog owners chatted about weekend plans and complained about the weather. For the first time since everything started, I wasn't checking over my shoulder or planning escape routes in my head. Max bounded through the grass with Luna right behind him, both dogs covered in mud from the morning rain. Another owner asked me about Max's breed, and I told them the usual half-lab story without my chest getting tight. Marcus called while I was loading the dogs into my car to tell me the civil case had finally reached settlement talks. Frank's court-appointed lawyer from jail had offered $25,000 from his retirement account, but Marcus wasn't having it. He knew the criminal conviction gave us leverage and pushed for more, sending back documentation of all the damages and emotional distress. 3 days later, Mom called with news that made my stomach turn in a weird mix of satisfaction and disgust. Frank had been moved to protective custody after what the guards called an incident with other inmates who found out about the animal abuse charges and the stuff with Derek. Mom heard it through her divorce lawyer, who got it from Frank's lawyer during some paperwork exchange. I felt nothing for him, just a cold sense of justice being served. The following week, Derek gave his testimony for the civil case through video deposition from his home in Seattle. Marcus played the recording for me, and I had to pause it twice when Derek talked about finding out Frank had stolen their grandmother's dying wish letter meant for him. Frank had sold the antique locket that was with it at a pawn shop for $40 when Derek was deployed overseas. Derek's voice cracked when he described coming home to find out the last connection to his grandmother was gone forever. That night, I woke up screaming from a nightmare where Frank had gotten out early and was standing in my bedroom reaching for Max. Both dogs were pressed against me, Max licking my face while Luna whined softly. Jessica came running in asking if I was okay and sat with me until my hands stopped shaking. She made tea, and we sat in the living room until sunrise while I tried to shake the image of Frank's face from my mind. A month later, Linda called me into her office and told me she was promoting me to team lead with a $15,000 raise. She said my dedication and resilience through everything showed the kind of leadership the company needed. The promotion meant I could finally start saving for a house with a real yard for the dogs instead of the tiny patch behind Jessica's rental. Mom's divorce went through the next week, and she got everything she asked for, including the house, half the retirement accounts, and monthly support payments. Frank tried to contest it from jail, but the judge shut him down since he had no legal standing while incarcerated for multiple felonies. Mom changed the locks that same day and had a security company install cameras and an alarm system. She sent me pictures of her redecorating the living room, painting over the beige walls Frank insisted on with bright colors he would have hated. The embezzlement trial started 2 weeks after that, and I took time off work to attend and support Frank's former co-workers who were testifying. Sitting in that courtroom listening to person after person describe how Frank had stolen from the company pension fund made me realize how many lives he'd destroyed beyond just our family. One woman cried, talking about how she couldn't retire now because her pension was gone. Another man explained how he'd had to take a second job to make up for the missing funds. By the time the trial ended a month later with Frank getting 5 more years added to his sentence, I felt exhausted but relieved. He'd be in prison until I was 35 at least, maybe longer if he didn't get parole. The news brought this weird grief for the father I never actually had, the one who should have protected me instead of selling my stuff for beer money. Marcus called that afternoon to tell me he'd negotiated the civil settlement up to $40,000 from Frank's remaining assets before the government seized them for restitution. After his legal fees, I'd have enough for a down payment on a small house with a big backyard where Max could run without a leash. Mom called the next week, asking if I wanted to grab dinner at that little Italian place near campus we used to go to when I was in college. She picked me up from Jessica's place, and we drove there in silence, both of us adjusting to this new reality without Frank looming over everything. The restaurant smelled exactly the same, garlic and basil and fresh bread, and we sat at the same corner booth we always used to claim. She ordered the chicken parmigiana like always, and I got the lasagna, and for the first few minutes we just ate and didn't talk about anything heavy. Then she started telling me about this time when I was 4, and Frank had actually built me a treehouse in the backyard, spending 3 whole weekends on it, how proud he'd been when I climbed up for the first time. She showed me a picture on her phone she'd saved from back then, me grinning with missing front teeth while Frank held the ladder steady below. We spent 2 hours summers there, her sharing these glimpses of the father he could have been before something broke in him. And when she dropped me back at Jessica's, she hugged me longer than she had in years. 3 days later, I met with a realtor Marcus had recommended, a woman named Sharon, who specialized in helping people relocate quickly after domestic situations. We looked at 12 houses over the next 2 weeks, driving all over Columbus to find something in my price range with a decent yard. Most were too expensive or needed too much work, but then she showed me this little 2-bedroom place on the north side, a quiet street with big oak trees and a huge fenced backyard. The house itself needed some paint, and the kitchen was dated, but the yard was perfect, almost half an acre with a 6-foot privacy fence all around. Max and Luna went crazy when I brought them to see it, running loops around the yard and rolling in the grass like they'd found paradise. I put in an offer that afternoon and spent the next week anxiously waiting while the seller considered 3 different bids. 9 months after the lawsuit started, I sat in the courtroom again for Frank's sentencing on the embezzlement charges. He looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, thinner, his hair completely gray now instead of just at the temples. The prosecutor laid out how he'd stolen almost $200,000 over 5 years, showing the judge spreadsheets and bank records and forged signatures. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Frank stood up and pointed right at me in the gallery. "This is all her fault," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She destroyed my life over a stupid dog, and now she's sitting there watching me burn." The bailiff moved toward him, but he kept going. "When I get out, she's going to pay for what she did to me." The judge's face went cold, and she added 6 months for threatening a witness, bringing his total sentence to 8 years, with possibility of parole in 5. They let him out, still yelling about how I'd ruined everything, his voice echoing down the hallway until the door slammed shut. My offer on the house got accepted 2 days later, and Jessica helped me move everything from her garage to my new place. She'd gotten attached to Max and Luna over the months they'd stayed with her, joking that she was losing her best security system as we loaded boxes into the rental truck. The dogs explored every inch of their new territory, Max marking every tree and fence post, while Luna dug a hole under the big oak in the back corner. Jessica stayed to help me unpack the kitchen stuff and set up my bed, and before she left, she made me promise to bring the dogs to visit at least once a month. That first night alone in my own house, every sound made me jump. The furnace clicking on sounded like footsteps. The ice maker dropping cubes sounded like someone trying the back door. Tree branches scraping the roof sounded like someone on the porch. I kept reminding myself Frank was locked up for years, that the prosecutor had sent me confirmation of his incarceration, but my body didn't care about logic. Max and Luna slept on the bed with me, something I'd never allowed before. Their warm weight, the only thing that let me drift off around 3 in the morning. Mom showed up the next weekend with a housewarming gift wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a photo album, thick and heavy, filled with pictures from my childhood I hadn't seen in years. Every single photo had been carefully edited or cropped to remove Frank, leaving just me and Mom at birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school plays, soccer games. She'd spent weeks working on it, she said, reclaiming our memories from his shadow, giving us back the good moments without his presence poisoning them. We sat on my new couch going through every page while she told me the stories behind each picture, the details I'd forgotten or never known. 10 months after everything started with the lawsuit, I finally worked up the courage to join a support group for adult survivors of parental abuse. The meetings were held in a church basement downtown, folding chairs in a circle, bad coffee in paper cups, but the people understood in ways nobody else could. I shared my story in pieces over several weeks: the bike, the gaming console, the money, and finally Max and the lawsuit and everything that followed. Other people shared their stories too, some worse than mine, some different but equally painful, and we all nodded and understood the complicated grief of mourning parents who were still alive. A month into the meetings, a thick envelope arrived from the state prison where Frank was held. My hands shook as I held it, wondering if I should open it or just throw it away, but finally I drove to Marcus's office and handed it to him still sealed. He read it quickly, his face getting tighter with each page, then looked up and said it was exactly what we expected: blame and manipulation and threats disguised as apologies. He made copies for our records in case Frank tried anything when he got out, then handed me the originals to do whatever I wanted with them. I burned them in my backyard fire pit that night, watching his words turn to ash and drift away on the wind. The next surprise came when Derek knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon. I hadn't seen my brother in over 10 years, not since he'd cut Frank off completely and moved to California, but there he was on my porch with a bottle of wine and a nervous smile. Max and Luna loved him immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about whether I could trust him, and we sat in the backyard while they climbed all over him demanding attention. After his 3rd beer, he told me about his dog Scout when we were teenagers, how Frank had taken him to the vet one day while Derek was at school and came back saying Scout had run away from the parking lot. Derek found out years later from Mom that Frank had put Scout down because he'd barked too much, but she'd been too scared to tell us the truth at the time. We both cried a little, then laughed at ourselves crying, then threw tennis balls for Max and Luna until the sun went down. 2 weeks later, I finally felt ready to have people over, so I invited Jessica, Mom, Linda from work, and a few friends from the support group for a small housewarming party. Jessica brought her famous 7-layer dip, Mom made her chocolate cake, Linda brought wine, and everyone else brought dog toys that Max and Luna immediately destroyed. For the first time since moving in, the house felt warm and full of life instead of like a hiding place. Max had finally relaxed enough to let strangers pet him without checking with me first, and Luna performed every trick she knew for treats and attention. Mom took pictures of everything, adding new memories to our reclaimed collection. And when everyone left that night, my face hurt from smiling so much. The months that followed felt like learning to breathe again after holding my breath for years. 11 months after the lawsuit started, I sat in my therapist's office staring at the ceiling when she asked her usual question about how often I'd thought about Frank that week. I opened my mouth to give my usual answer, but stopped, realizing I hadn't thought about him in 3 whole days until she brought him up. She actually clapped her hands and wrote something in her notebook, saying this was a huge milestone that meant Frank wasn't controlling my daily thoughts anymore. Mom called me the next week with news that shocked me, even though I'd been expecting it for months. She'd listed the house for sale because she couldn't stand living there with all the memories of Frank's rage and control in every room. The realtor had already found a buyer, and Mom had put an offer on a small condo just 15 minutes from my place. We spent the next month packing up her things, sorting through decades of stuff, throwing away anything that reminded her of Frank's worst moments. The day she moved in, we started new traditions right away. Sunday dinners at my place where she'd help cook, while Max and Luna begged for scraps. Tuesday morning dog park visits where she'd bring coffee and we'd watch the dogs play. Marcus called me 3 weeks later with news that made my blood run cold. Frank had been calling Mom from prison using other inmates' phone privileges, violating the no-contact order the judge had put in place. The prison had recorded everything, 23 calls over 2 weeks, each one full of threats about what he'd do when he got out, trying to manipulate her into sending money, blaming her for not stopping me from ruining his life. The warden had already filed charges, and Frank's sentence got extended by another year, plus he lost all phone privileges for 6 months. Around that same time, I started talking to someone at the dog park, a guy whose golden retriever played with Luna every morning. He understood why I needed to take things slow, why I flinched when anyone raised their voice, why I always sat facing the door in restaurants. Max and Luna loved him immediately, which mattered more than anything since they'd become my judges of character. We took things incredibly slow, just dog park meetings for 2 months, then coffee, then actual dates, always with me setting the pace and him never pushing for more. The 1-year anniversary of leaving Frank's house hit me harder than I expected. I sat in my living room that morning looking around at everything I'd built without him. I owned this house, had gotten promoted to senior analyst at work, had 2 happy dogs sprawled on the couch, a healing relationship with Mom, and most importantly, I could go entire weeks without that crushing fear I used to live with every single day. Mom surprised me that afternoon by telling me she'd started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter downtown. She helped other people fill out paperwork for restraining orders, drove them to court dates, sat with them while they cried about their situations. She said helping others escape gave her purpose beyond just being Frank's victim, that every person she helped felt like taking back a piece of power Frank had stolen from her. Marcus showed up at my door the following week with paperwork and a concerned look on his face. Frank had been placed in psychiatric evaluation after guards reported increasingly erratic behavior, screaming at walls, making threats against people who weren't there, writing hundreds of letters to judges and lawyers claiming conspiracy theories about why he was in prison. The psychiatrist diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits, which surprised absolutely no one, but meant he'd have mandatory therapy sessions that he'd probably ignore. A month later, I got an official letter from the Department of Corrections that made my hands shake. Frank's prison psychiatrist was requesting family history for treatment purposes, wanting detailed documentation of his behavior patterns, his childhood that I knew about, specific incidents of abuse or violence. I spent 3 days writing everything down, every bike he gave away, every possession he sold, every time he'd hit Mom when he thought I wasn't watching, every manipulation and threat and moment of control. I sent 12 pages of single-space documentation, hoping maybe someone could finally make Frank understand what he'd done, even though I knew he'd never actually change or take responsibility. By 14 months after the lawsuit, my life had settled into something I never thought I'd have. My partner and I decided to move in together, carefully and respectfully blending our lives with tons of communication about boundaries and space. They brought their rescue cat, a orange tabby named Mango, and I held my breath watching Max and Luna's reaction. Luna sniffed Mango once and went back to her toys, while Max decided the cat was just another friend to protect, following Mango around the house like a gentle bodyguard. 2 weeks after we'd settled into our new routine, Marcus called with news that made my chest tight with fresh fear. During a routine check of Frank's prison communications, investigators discovered he'd been trying to manipulate his cellmate into handling me once the guy got released in 6 months. Frank had drawn maps to my house, written down my work schedule, promised the guy money he didn't have if he'd teach me a lesson about respect. The cellmate had reported it immediately to guards, not wanting any part of Frank's plan. Prison officials moved Frank to maximum security that same day, placed him in solitary for 30 days pending investigation, and the prosecutor filed new charges that would extend his sentence to 15 years minimum. The news spread through the prison system fast enough that Frank lost any chance of making allies or deals, and I finally started sleeping through the night without checking the locks 3 times. Mom moved in with me permanently after the trial ended, and we spent weeks just existing in the same space without talking about Frank at all. I took down half the security cameras I'd installed, keeping only the ones by the doors, and stopped jumping every time a car drove past the house. My therapist said the hypervigilance would fade with time, and she was right about that. 6 months after Frank went away, Mom started going to a book club at the library, something she'd she'd never been allowed to do before. She met a widower there named Paul, who brought her coffee and actually listened when she talked. At first, she'd come home from meetings looking guilty, like she was doing something wrong by having a conversation with a man who wasn't frank. Paul never pushed, never demanded, just kept showing up with her favorite coffee order and asking about the books she was reading. I watched her slowly remember what it felt like to be treated with basic respect. Around the same time, I saw a post online about a senior beagle named Chester, whose owner had died. The rescue said he was too old for most adopters, 12 years with bad teeth and cloudy eyes. I drove out to meet him that afternoon, and he pressed his gray muzzle into my hand like he'd known me forever. Max and Luna sniffed him carefully when I brought him home. Then Luna groomed his ears, while Max brought him his favorite tennis ball. Chester settled into our pack like he'd always belonged there, spending most days sleeping in sunny spots and following me room to room with his slow, determined walk. Derek started coming over every Sunday to work on projects in the garage. He'd been Frank's brother in name only for years, disgusted by what Frank had become, and now he was trying to be the uncle I'd never had. He taught me to use a table saw, how to measure twice and cut once, how to build things that would last. Frank had always claimed he was good with his hands, but Derek actually was, patient and precise where Frank had been sloppy and rushed. We built a new fence for the dogs, a bookshelf for Mom, a coffee table from reclaimed wood. Derek never mentioned Frank unless I brought him up first, and even then, he'd just shake his head and change the subject. 18 months after the lawsuit, on what would have been Frank's birthday, Mom and I took the dogs hiking at a state park 2 hours away. Neither of us mentioned the date, but we both knew. We walked for hours, the dogs investigating every tree and rock, Chester riding in a carrier on my back when his legs got tired. Mom picked wildflowers and talked about maybe taking a painting class. We ate sandwiches by a creek and watched Max try to catch minnows he could see but never quite reach. That night, we ordered Chinese food and watched a movie, and Frank's name never came up once. My therapy sessions dropped to once a month, then every other month. My therapist noted in her files that I'd made remarkable progress processing the trauma, that my boundaries were solid and my coping mechanisms healthy. The work wasn't done, might never be completely done, but the crisis had passed. I could talk about Frank without my hands shaking, could tell the story without reliving it. Marcus called one afternoon with what he said was the last update I'd need. Frank's appeals had all been denied. His sentences were running consecutive, not concurrent, and with his behavior in prison, including the recent attempt to hire someone to hurt me, he wouldn't be eligible for parole for at least 12 years. The legal chapter was officially closed. Marcus had handled everything pro bono from start to finish, refusing every attempt I made to pay him. 2 years after the lawsuit, I noticed Max moving slower on our morning walks. The vet confirmed arthritis in his hips, common for a dog his age. I bought joint supplements, adjusted our route to avoid steep hills, added more rugs so he wouldn't slip on the hardwood floors. Every gray hair on his muzzle reminded me how much time had passed since that day Frank tried to sell him. Max adapted to his limitations with the same steady patience he'd shown through everything else, content to take shorter walks and longer naps. At the support group for abuse survivors, I became one of the mentors. A woman came in one week, shaking and crying, saying her father had poisoned her cat because she'd refused to loan him money. I sat with her for 2 hours, gave her the number for the same lawyer who'd helped me, told her about emergency protective orders and security cameras and keeping documentation of everything. I watched her straighten her shoulders and make the first phone call. The cycle of helping others heal helped me heal too. Now, I'm sitting on my back porch, watching Max, Luna, and Chester investigate something fascinating in the corner of the yard. My partner is grilling burgers while Mom sets the picnic table with the dishes we bought at an estate sale last month. Derek's truck just pulled up, and I can see his new girlfriend checking her hair in the side mirror before they get out. Paul is already here, helping Mom with the plates, making her laugh at something. The dogs bark at a squirrel, then return to their investigation. Max moves carefully, but his tail still wags with the same enthusiasm. Chester barks his rusty old man bark. Luna races circles around them both. This is my family, the one I chose and built and protected. Frank is a distant shadow, locked in a concrete box where he'll stay for more than a decade. His name rarely comes up anymore. I haven't looked over my shoulder in months. I'm not running anymore because there's nothing to run from. I'm home.